The gun was still warm in her hands when Jeremiah Dunlap realized he was ruined. Not by the shot, not by the way she had steadied her breathing exactly the way he had taught her, or the way her dark eyes had narrowed with a focus that made his chest ache. It was the moment after, when Esther Langley turned to look at him with that quiet, devastating smile on her face, the tin can 30 yards away spinning off its post in the hot Nevada dust, and he understood, with the kind of terrible clarity that men like him spent whole lifetimes trying to avoid, that he was never going to be free of her. He had said yes to teaching her. He should have said no. He should have walked away from the Langley property and never looked back, because he had known from the first instant he laid eyes on her that Esther Langley was the single most dangerous thing in the Nevada territory, and it had nothing to do with the Colt revolver she was now holding. "Did I do it right?" she asked. Her voice was low and steady, the same voice she used when she was reading to herself on the porch, the same voice that came through the thin walls of the boarding house at night when he lay awake staring at the ceiling. A voice that had no business being this close to him, a voice that carried secrets he did not yet know. "You did it exactly right," he said. And that was the moment. That was the moment Jeremiah Dunlap stepped off the edge of a cliff he had been carefully circling for 3 weeks, and he did not even realize he was falling until the ground was already gone beneath his boots. But to understand why that moment mattered, to understand why a man who had survived Comanche raids, 3 years of cattle drives across hostile country, and a gunshot wound to the left shoulder was utterly laid flat by a woman holding a revolver, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to the morning of September the 3rd, 1878, when Esther Langley arrived in Calico Bend, Nevada, on the afternoon stage with nothing but a brown leather trunk, a fierce expression, and a hidden motive that she had not yet decided to reveal to anyone. Calico Bend was not the kind of town that made fine impressions. It sat at the bottom of a shallow valley between 2 low ridges of sun-baked rock, and in the dry months the dust was so thick it turned the air orange by mid-afternoon. There were 14 buildings on the main street, which locals called Front Street, though it faced nothing in particular. There was a general store run by a man named Hodges who weighed everything twice and charged you for both weighings. There was a saloon called the Copper Kettle that served 3 varieties of whiskey, all of them bad. There was a livery stable, a land office, a small church whose preacher had recently departed under circumstances no one discussed in polite company, and a boarding house run by a widow named Clara Fitch who kept the rooms clean and the rules strict. The stage pulled in at 2:30, and Jeremiah Dunlap was leaning against the post outside the land office, not because he had any business there that afternoon, but because it was the coolest spot on Front Street, and he had been in Calico Bend for 6 days already without finding a good reason to leave. He had not been looking for a reason to stay, either. Jeremiah was 29 years old and had been moving through the Nevada territory for the better part of 4 years, taking work where he found it, ranch hand, scout, occasional deputy, when a sheriff was desperate enough, and generally making himself as uncomplicated as possible to everyone around him. He was tall and lean, with hands that were rough from work and a face that was not handsome in any easy sense, but was the kind of face that people remembered. His eyes were dark gray, like the sky before a storm, and he had a way of going completely still when he was watching something that made men nervous and women, he had noticed, something other than nervous. He was not watching for anything in particular when the stage came in, but he saw her immediately. Esther Langley stepped down from the stage the way a woman steps into a room she has already decided she owns. She was 24 years old, though Jeremiah did not know that yet. She had dark auburn hair pulled back under a traveling bonnet, and even after what must have been a 2-day journey across rocky desert, she looked as though she had been somewhere intentional. Her dress was plain, practical brown wool, not fashionable, not flashy, and she carried herself with a kind of contained energy, like a spring wound tight. She looked around at Calico Bend with absolutely no expression on her face. Then she looked directly at Jeremiah Dunlap, and he forgot what he was leaning against. She did not hold the look. She turned to the stage driver, said something he could not hear, and directed her attention to the unloading of her trunk. Professional, efficient, unremarkable, except that she had looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that in those 3 seconds she had already determined everything she needed to know about him, filed it away, and moved on. He pushed himself off the post, straightened his hat, and went to help with the trunk before he had consciously decided to do so. "I've got it," she said, not looking up. "It's heavy," he said, because it clearly was. "I know how heavy it is," she said. "I packed it." He helped with the trunk anyway, because she was right about its weight and wrong about being able to manage it alone, and she accepted the help without thanking him and without acknowledging the awkwardness of the silence. She directed him to Clara Fitch's boarding house, which she had apparently arranged in advance by letter, and when they reached the door she turned and looked at him again with those dark, measuring eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Mr. Dunlap," he said. "Jeremiah Dunlap." "Thank you, Mr. Dunlap." She paused. "I'm Esther Langley." "I figured," he said. One corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite amusement. "Did you?" She went inside. Jeremiah stood on the step for a moment longer than was necessary, then walked back to the land office, not because he had any business there, but because he needed to walk somewhere. He told himself that evening, sitting in the copper kettle with a glass of the least bad whiskey, that she was just a woman passing through. People came to Calico Bend and left it all the time. The fact that she had looked at him with that unnerving directness meant nothing. The fact that he had noticed the way her hands were slightly calloused at the fingertips, a detail he had absolutely no business noticing, meant nothing. He was going to finish his drink and get a good night's sleep, and in the morning he would ride south toward the Humboldt and see about a job he had heard mention of. He woke up the next morning and went to the general store instead, which was directly across the street from the boarding house. Over the next several days, Jeremiah Dunlap had to acknowledge, privately, with considerable reluctance, that he had a problem. He kept finding himself in proximity to Esther Langley, which should not have been difficult to avoid in a town with 14 buildings, except that she seemed to be everywhere. She was at the general store in the mornings. She was walking along the Ridge Road in the afternoons. She was sitting on the porch of Clara Fitch's boarding house in the evenings with a book, reading in the last light with the kind of absorption that made him feel guilty for watching. He learned things about her in fragments and snatches of conversation, because she was not unfriendly, just careful. She was from Kansas, originally. She had come to Nevada on what she described as personal business, which she did not elaborate on. She had no family in the territory and no apparent acquaintances. She asked more questions than she answered, and she had a habit of going completely still and attentive when someone was speaking to her that was deeply unsettling because it made you feel inaccurately that you were the most interesting person she had ever met. The hidden motive, because there was one, he was certain of it, he could not yet see, but he could feel it. Esther Langley had come to Calico Bend for a reason, and it was not the climate. It was the end of the first week, when she asked him about the Langley property. They had been sharing a table at the boarding house for breakfast, which was not unusual. Clara Fitch had only one long table and everyone ate at it, and Esther had been looking at him over her coffee cup in that way she had, like she was solving an equation. "You know this territory well," she said. It was not a question. "Reasonably well," he said. "I'm looking for a piece of land that belonged to my father," she said. "Out past the Bitter Creek Wash, about 8 miles northeast. He filed on it 11 years ago and never did anything with it. I have the deed." She paused. "I want to see it." He looked at her carefully. "That's rough country out there. What do you want with it?" "That's personal," she said pleasantly. He should have left it there. Instead he said, "I can take you out there," which was how he came to spend a full day riding through the Nevada high desert with Esther Langley, which did absolutely nothing for his increasingly desperate attempt to regard her as a passing stranger. The land was rough and beautiful in the way that Nevada country was when you caught it at the right angle, long sweeps of sage and dry grass, red rock outcroppings, the distant shimmer of salt flat. Esther rode well, which surprised him until it did not, because nothing about her should have surprised him by now. She sat a horse like someone who had grown up doing it and then stopped for a while and had recently remembered. She did not talk much on the ride out, which he appreciated, because talking required him to look at her and looking at her required him to not look where he was going. The land itself, when they reached it, was a long rectangle of high desert backed up against a low ridge. There was a dry creek bed, dormant cottonwoods that would have water in spring, and the remains of a small structure, foundations, and one partial wall of what had been planned as a homestead but never finished. Esther got off her horse and walked to the middle of the property and stood very still for a long time. He stayed back, because this was clearly something private. When she came back, her eyes were bright in a way that might have been tears if she were the sort of person who cried in front of strangers, which he already knew she was not. "My father bought this in 1867, she said. "He was going to bring us all out here, start fresh. He'd had a bad time of things in Kansas. He said Nevada was going to be different." "What happened?" Jeremiah asked, because the question felt like it needed asking. "He died in 1869, she said. "Influenza." She looked at the half-built wall. "My mother sold off everything she could and we stayed in Kansas. I inherited this when she passed last year." She said it flatly, without asking for comfort, and he gave her none because she did not want any. He respected that. "It's good land," he said. "Better than it looks. That creek bed runs in March and April. There's a spring on the north side of the ridge." She turned and looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Scouted this area in '75, he said. "For a cattle operation that never materialized." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to build on it," she said. He waited. "I have some money, not a great deal. I need to know if it's viable." She looked at the land again. "I'm not going back to Kansas." "Why not?" She met his eyes, and for the first time she looked like she was considering telling him something true. Then the door behind her expression closed politely, and she said, "It's not home anymore." He nodded and did not push, though he had the persistent feeling that there was a dark past threaded through that simple sentence. Something that had sent her out here with her dead father's land deed, and a trunk packed so heavy a man could barely lift it. On the way back, when the sun was going down behind the western ridges and turning the desert gold, she said, almost carelessly, "Do you know how to shoot?" He looked at her sideways. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know how to shoot." She nodded slowly, like this was information she was adding to a list. "Well," she said, "I don't." He waited. "I probably should," she said. "Woman alone on a piece of land like that." He said nothing because he agreed with her completely and was very afraid of where this was heading. "Would you teach me?" she asked. He looked straight ahead at the darkening trail and thought about all the reasons he should say no. He thought about the way she looked when she turned to look at him. He thought about the fact that he was already spending too much time in Calico Bend, already drifting toward the gravity of this woman the way water moves toward a low place in the land. Teaching her to shoot would mean standing behind her with his hands on her arms to correct her position. It would mean being close enough to smell the soap she used, which was plain and clean and somehow entirely too present in his mind already. It would mean finding another reason to stay. He said yes. Later he would identify this as the moment the trap closed. Not a trap she had set deliberately. He was certain of that, would remain certain of it. But a trap nonetheless, the way certain beautiful pieces of country were traps. You walked in on a clear morning thinking you were just passing through, and then the season changed, and the road behind you was gone, and you had somehow become someone who lived there. He began teaching her to shoot the following morning. Clara Fitch's boarding house backed onto a wide stretch of flat open land that ended at a dry arroyo, and it was here that Jeremiah set up an improvised range with posts driven into the ground and tin cans from the general store's waste pile. He brought his own Colt single-action Army revolver, which he had carried since 1873 and knew like an extension of his own hand. He had taught 3 people to shoot before, 2 ranch hands and a cook on a cattle drive who had been frightened of firearms his entire life. Teaching was not unfamiliar to him. Teaching Esther Langley was a completely different experience from the first moment. She stood very straight and attentive as he explained the mechanics of the gun. She asked precise questions. When he showed her how to hold it, both hands steady, weight slightly forward, she listened to every word and then did exactly what he said. There was no giggling, no performing fear she did not feel, no looking to him for reassurance. She simply absorbed the instruction and applied it. This would have been fine, professionally speaking, except that he had to stand close to her to correct her grip, and she was entirely unself-conscious about his proximity in a way that suggested she was focused on the lesson rather than on him. And for reasons he could not explain rationally, this drove him nearly out of his mind. The first day she did not fire the gun. He had her practice the stance, the grip, the act of raising and aiming in a smooth motion, over and over until it was natural. She was patient about this, which surprised him. He had expected impatience. She did not display any. Walking back to the boarding house that evening, he asked, "Have you ever done anything like this before?" "Shot a gun," she said. "No." "Learned something difficult," he said. She glanced at him. "I learned to keep a house and 3 younger siblings together after my father died and before my mother found her footing," she said. "I was 16. She paused. "I have some experience with difficult things." He absorbed this, adding it to what he knew about her. 16 years old and running a household. That explained the self-sufficiency, the refusal of help she did not strictly need, the practical quality that ran through every interaction like iron wire through wood. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said, not unkindly. "It made me useful." On the second day of lessons, she fired the gun for the first time. He watched her take the first shot and absorb the recoil without flinching, turn and look at where the bullet had hit 6 inches left of the tin can, not bad for a first shot, and then turn back to him with that focused expression. "Left," she said. "Slightly," he confirmed. "My wrist," she said. "I'm compensating something." "Your elbow," he corrected. "Come here." He adjusted her position, standing slightly behind her and to her left, his hand light on her arm to show her the angle. She corrected immediately. The second shot took the tin can clean off the post. She lowered the gun and turned to look at him, and there was something bright and alive in her face that he had not seen before, not the contained, measuring expression she usually wore, but something genuine and unguarded, the pleasure of a person who has just accomplished something real. "That's it," he said. She laughed. Just briefly, just once, but it was warm and genuine, and it hit him somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum with a force entirely disproportionate to the event. This was a problem. Over the next 2 weeks, the problem only deepened. They met every morning at the makeshift range behind the boarding house. He taught her to reload under pressure, to aim quickly rather than carefully, to understand the range and limitations of the weapon she was using. She improved faster than any student he had taught, because she applied herself to it with the same iron discipline she apparently applied to everything. By the end of the first week, she was hitting a moving tin can on a string at 20 yards more often than not. But it was not the shooting that was the problem. The problem was everything around the shooting. It was the conversations on the walk out and back that lengthened day by day until they were coming home in the dark. It was the way she thought sharply, directly, with a refusal to accept comfortable answers that he found exhilarating and maddening in equal measure. It was the jokes she made, dry and unexpected, that caught him off guard every time. It was the way she listened completely when he talked, which he did more and more because she asked questions that demanded real answers. He told her about the cattle drives. He told her about the 3 years he had spent working for a ranch operation in central Nevada that had gone bankrupt in the panic of 1873, leaving him and a dozen other men without wages or prospects. He told her about the Comanche raid he had survived by playing dead for 4 hours in a shallow ravine, which was not a story he usually told anyone. She told him about Kansas. Not all of it. She still kept the dark past locked behind that careful door, but pieces. The drought years in the early 1870s that had been savage on the plains. The way her mother had reinvented herself after the grief of losing their father, slowly and painfully, like a person learning to use a limb that had been broken. The three younger siblings who were now scattered, one brother married in Missouri, one sister teaching school in Illinois, a youngest sister who had followed a man to California and was reported to be happy about it. And there was no one in Kansas who could make you stay. He asked one evening when they were sitting on opposite ends of the porch in the fading heat, and the question was more loaded than he had intended it to be. She looked at him steadily. "There was a man," she said. He kept his face very neutral. "For a few years," she said. "He wanted someone more manageable than me." "His loss," Jeremiah said before he could stop himself. She looked at him for a long moment, and the air between them was suddenly different, charged with something neither of them had put into words yet. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was." He looked away at the dark street and told himself firmly that this was not the moment to say anything else. But the moment had been there, and they had both felt it, and after that the pretense that they were simply an acquaintance and a student became harder to maintain. It was Mrs. Clara Fitch, sharp-eyed, kind-hearted, no fool on any count, who said something first. She cornered Jeremiah one morning in the narrow hallway before he could escape to breakfast. "Mr. Dunlap," she said in the tone of a woman who had decided something, "you have been in my establishment for going on 3 weeks now." "Yes, ma'am," he said carefully. "You have found, I think, a reason to stay," she said, looking at him over her spectacles. He said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. "She's a good woman," Clara said. "A very good woman, and she has had a harder time of it than she lets on." She paused. "I would not like to see her hurt by a man who has not made up his mind." "I take your meaning," he said. "I hope you do," she said pleasantly, and let him pass. He spent a great deal of that day's shooting lesson being more careful than usual, which meant he was stiff and formal and overcorrective in his instructions. And at the end of it Esther said, with that directness that was both her most disarming and most confronting quality, "What's wrong with you today?" "Nothing," he said. She looked at him. "You've been treating me like a stranger since breakfast." "I've been teaching you to shoot," he said. "You've been teaching me to shoot the way a man teaches something to someone he doesn't much like," she said. She was not angry. She was just accurate, which was worse. "If I've done something to offend you, I would rather know about it." He looked at her for a long moment, standing there in the afternoon dust with the Colt in her hand and that calm, direct gaze, and he made a decision. "You haven't done anything," he said. "The problem is the opposite of that. Silence." She looked at him without moving. "I've been trying to be careful," he said. "I don't want to make things complicated for you when you're trying to build something here." Very slowly, she set the revolver down on the post in front of her, the way a person sets something down when they want their hands free. "Jeremiah," she said. This was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it did something entirely unfair to his composure. "How long have you been a man who runs from complicated?" "Longer than I'd care to admit," he said honestly. "And how has that worked out for you?" He looked at the desert and the sky above it and the dry, beautiful, indifferent landscape of the Nevada Territory, and he thought about 4 years of moving and not staying, and he said, "Not particularly well." She walked toward him, stopped 2 feet away, and looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had seen through every protective distance he had put up since the moment he first crossed paths with her. "I am not a person who breaks easily," she said. "I don't need managing. I don't need protecting from complicated things." She paused. "I would, however, like you to stop pretending that you don't feel what you feel." He looked at her for a long time, then he said, "That's a very direct thing to say." "I find direct saves time," she said. "Esther," he said. "Jeremiah," she said back, steady. He reached out and took her hand, her right hand, the one that was calloused from the shooting lessons and the years of work before that, and held it, and neither of them said anything for a while, standing in the dry Nevada afternoon with the sage smell on the air and the whole wide open country around them. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice had changed. This was the other voice, the one beneath the practical, composed surface. Quieter, more careful. "All right," he said. She did not immediately speak. He could feel the decision working through her, the way he could feel weather coming in through the quality of the air. "The reason I came to Calico Bend," she said, "it's not only about the land." He waited. "There is a man," she said. "His name is Gordon Price. He came to Kansas 3 years ago and convinced my mother, who was in poor health at the time and not clear thinking, to sign over a portion of her assets to him. He told her it was an investment. It was not an investment." She stopped. "I found out what he had done. I tried to have him charged. I was told there was nothing to be done, that she had signed the papers willingly." Her voice was flat and controlled, but underneath it he could hear the fury that had been living there for some time. "He moved on before I could do anything more. I tracked him to Nevada through a contact at a land office in Reno. He is operating out of the Calico Bend area. I came here to—" She stopped. "To what?" Jeremiah asked, though he thought he already knew. "To recover what he took," she said. "My mother is gone now. I can't get anything back for her, but he took her property and I want it documented. I want him held accountable. I want the law to do something this time." He released her hand slowly. "Is this why you wanted to learn to shoot?" She met his eyes, unflinching. "Yes, Esther," he said, and now his voice had the same quality as hers, quiet, careful, holding something larger underneath. "A woman alone going after a man like that in a territory like this, that is not a small thing to walk into." "I know that," she said. "What were you planning to do? Walk up to him with a Colt revolver?" "I was planning to go to the county sheriff with documentation," she said crisply, "and to be in a position to defend myself if necessary. I'm not foolish." He looked at her. No, she was not foolish. She was, in fact, the least foolish person he had met in a very long time, which made this more frightening rather than less. "Who is Gordon Price in this territory?" he asked. She hesitated, and he knew this was the piece she had been most reluctant to say. "He has been operating as a land agent," she said. "He filed some claims in this district about 18 months ago. From what I can determine, he has been running the same scheme he ran on my mother, approaching widows and people with inherited land claims, presenting himself as an investment partner and walking away with their assets." She looked at him. "He's here, Jeremiah. He's in Calico Bend. He was at the general store the day I arrived." Jeremiah went still the way he went still when he was processing information that required him to recalibrate everything. "What does he look like?" he asked. She described him. Medium height, heavyset, fair hair going to gray, a voice that was smooth and pleasant, a way of making you feel like you were in good hands. Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "I know who you're talking about," he said. She stared at him. "How?" "He tried to buy my time last week," he said. "Said he needed a guide to some land parcels northeast of here. I told him I wasn't available." He paused. He had a smooth manner that set my teeth on edge. Esther's expression had gone complicated surprise, relief, and something that might have been guilt all working through it together. "I should have told you before now," she said. "Yes," he said, "you should have. I didn't know if I could trust you. And now," she looked at him very directly. "Now I trust you completely," she said, "which is either sensible or very foolish, and I have not yet determined which." "I'm going to help you," he said. "Jeremiah, I'm going to help you do this the right way," he said. "Through the sheriff's office. With documentation. Not with a Colt revolver in a confrontation that could go badly in 20 different directions." He held her gaze. "But I'm going to need you to tell me everything, not just the parts you've already decided to share." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the faintest trace of something that might have been relief, "All right." They talked until well after dark that evening. Not on the porch, inside, at Clara Fitch's dining table, with the lamp burning between them and the sounds of the desert night through the windows. Esther produced a leather satchel from her trunk. This was the weight of it, he realized. Not clothes and provisions, but documents, and laid out 3 years of careful work. She had letters. She had copies of the fraudulent investment agreements her mother had signed, obtained through a lawyer friend in Kansas City. She had a sworn statement from a woman in Reno who had suffered a similar loss at Price's hands. She had a record of the land claims he had filed in Nevada, cross-referenced with the dates of his movement through various towns, building a timeline of a man who moved through territories preying on vulnerable people with inheritable land and limited legal recourse. Jeremiah looked at all of it and felt a deep, complicated anger, partly on Esther's behalf, partly at the specific kind of betrayal involved, the kind that targeted grief and loss and turned them into mechanisms of theft. He had seen injustice in his years on the frontier, and there was always something particularly corroded about the kind that came dressed in the language of help. "This is solid," he said. "It's not everything you'd need for a criminal prosecution, but it's more than most county sheriffs see in 3 months of work." "I know," she said, "which is why I need someone who knows this territory and knows who to talk to." He looked at her across the table. "You planned this very carefully." "I've had 3 years," she said. "And me?" he asked quietly. She met his eyes. "I didn't plan you," she said. There was something in her voice that was entirely different from her practical, direct tone, softer and more uncertain. "I didn't plan any part of this." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she did not move away. "I'll go to the county sheriff's office in Elko first thing in the morning," he said. "I know the deputy marshal there. We served as scouts together in '76. He is not a man who can be bought." She exhaled. Just once, just quietly, but he had the impression of something very heavy being partially set down. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Price has to still be in the territory. Men like him move when they feel observed." "I've been careful," she said. "I know you have," he said. "I meant that I need to move quickly." The problem with moving quickly to Elko was that Elko was 60 miles east, a 2-day hard ride through country that in September was hot and dry and not forgiving of poor planning. Jeremiah spent the morning preparing packing provisions, making sure his horse was sound, retrieving his rifle from the boarding house room, where it had been leaning against the wall unused since his arrival in Calico Bend. Esther appeared in the doorway as he was checking the rifle over. "I'm coming with you," she said. He looked up. "No, I have all the documentation," she said. "The deputy marshal will want to speak to a direct witness." "I can bring the documentation." "Jeremiah," the voice was patient but absolute. "This is my matter. I have been managing it alone for 3 years. I'm not going to hand it to you and wait on a porch." He held her gaze for a long, difficult moment. She was right, and he knew she was right, and he did not like it at all, primarily because the thought of her anywhere near the potential complications of this situation made something in him go cold. "You ride well?" he asked. "You've seen me ride," she said. 2 days on hard country is different from 8 miles to a land claim. "I managed 3 years of drought in Kansas," she said. "I believe I can manage 60 miles to Elko." He picked up the rifle and set it in its scabbard. "We leave in an hour," he said. "Pack light." She was ready in 40 minutes. They rode east out of Calico Bend in the early morning cool before the heat built. The country opened up around them, almost immediately wide sage flats, broken here and there by outcroppings of red and ochre rock, the sky a hard, clear blue overhead. Jeremiah set a steady pace, not punishing but not leisurely, and Esther kept it without complaint. They rode mostly in a companionable quiet, which was the kind of quiet that was only possible between people who had established something. He was aware of her beside him the way he was always aware of her, with an attention that went beyond what was strictly necessary. But it was easier here, in the open country, with the specific purpose of the journey giving them both something practical to focus on. Around midday, when they stopped to rest the horses in the shade of a rock formation, she said without looking at him, "What are you going to do after this?" He handed her the water canteen. "After what?" "After Elko. After this business with Price is resolved." She took a drink, handed it back. "You've been in Calico Bend for nearly a month. You told me you haven't stayed anywhere for 4 years." He looked at the rocks and the sky. "What made you ask?" "I'm trying to understand something," she said, "about what kind of man you are." "What kind of man do you think I am?" She considered this with her usual seriousness. "I think you're a man who stopped putting down roots after something hurt him badly enough," she said. "And I think staying in Calico Bend has started to frighten you because it means admitting that you might want to." He was quiet for a long time. "My wife died," he said. It was the first time he had said it to anyone in 2 years. "In 1874, fever. We had been married 8 months. We had a small place outside of Carson City." He looked at the ground. "After that I sold the place and started moving." She was very still beside him. "I'm sorry," she said. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "She was kind. She deserved more than 8 months." He paused. "I think I believed for a while that moving fast enough meant you couldn't lose anything because you hadn't got around to having it yet." "And now?" she asked softly. He looked at her. In the shade of the rocks in the midday desert, with the heat all around them and the dry smell of sage and dust, her face was entirely open in a way it rarely was, the measuring, careful expression gone, just Esther, just this woman who had been carrying her own weight of loss and anger and determination for 3 years, and had somehow, in the middle of all of it, managed to matter to him in a way he had not expected to allow. "Now," he said, "I'm starting to think the moving was a mistake." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she leaned forward just slightly and kissed him once, brief and certain, the way she did everything. When she sat back, her eyes were bright. "Right then," she said, "we should keep moving." He stared at her for a second, then laughed, a real laugh, not the careful, contained kind he usually produced, and got to his feet and held out a hand to help her up, and she took it. They reached the outskirts of Elko late the following afternoon, dusty and trail-worn and comfortable in each other's company in a way that felt like it had been true for years rather than weeks. The United States Marshal's district office in Elko was a small, solid building on the north end of the main street, and the deputy marshal who answered Jeremiah's knock was a large, weathered man in his early 40s named Walter Hearn, who looked at Jeremiah for a moment and then broke into a wide, surprised grin. "Dunlap," he said, "I wondered when you were going to turn up in my part of the world." "Walt," Jeremiah said, "I need your ear." Walt Hearn was exactly the man Jeremiah had represented him to be: practical, experienced, and not for sale. He spent 2 hours with Esther, going through her documentation with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. He asked questions that were incisive and specific, and Esther answered them with the same precision she brought to everything. At the end of it, he leaned back in his chair and said, "This is the most organized complaint I have received in this office in living memory." "I have had 3 years to organize it," Esther said. "Gordon Price," Walt said, turning the name over. "He operated in Reno about 2 years ago under the name Garrett. We had a complaint then that went nowhere because the witness left the territory." He looked at the papers. "If he's in Calico Bend now, and you have a corroborating witness who can be reached—" "She's in Reno," Esther said. "I have her address and she has agreed to testify." Walt looked at Jeremiah. "Where did you find this woman?" "She found me," Jeremiah said. Walt dispatched a writer to Reno that same evening with a letter for the corroborating witness. He told Esther that he would need to consult with the county prosecutor before taking formal action, but that on the strength of the documentation alone, he believed he could issue a warrant within 2 weeks if the corroboration held. "What I need from you," he said to Esther, "is for you to stay in Calico Bend, behave normally, and not confront Gordon Price directly. If he moves before I can act, we lose him." "I understand," Esther said. "Can I trust you to do that?" Walt asked. Esther looked at him calmly. "I did not ride 60 miles through the desert to compromise 3 years of work at the last moment," she said. Walt Hearn smiled. "Fair enough," he said. They stayed in Elko that night at a respectable hotel's separate rooms which Clara Fitch would have approved of, and the following morning over breakfast Esther was quieter than usual, not unhappy quiet. Relieved quiet, like a person who has set down a weight they have been carrying so long they had forgotten it could be set down. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it seriously, which was her way. "Strange," she said. "I've been holding this for so long alone. Having someone else know it, someone helping, it's unfamiliar." "Strange good or strange bad?" She looked at him across the breakfast table. "Very strange good," she said softly. He smiled at her. On the ride back west, they talked about the land. Her land, the Langley property, the 40 acres of high desert with the seasonal creek and the unfinished foundation. She described what she imagined there with a practicality that was also, somehow, deeply hopeful. A proper house, modest but solid, thick walls against the summer heat. A kitchen garden in the flat ground near the creek bed. Enough livestock to be self-sustaining chickens, a milk cow, perhaps goats. "That's a lot to do alone," he said. "I know," she said. She did not look at him as she said it, which told him she was aware of the implication and had decided to let it sit in the air between them without forcing it. He let it sit. He let it sit for about 3 miles of Nevada desert, and then he said, "I know construction. I spent a winter in 1875 helping a man build his ranch house outside of Austin. Stone and timber. I'm not an expert, but I'm competent." She said nothing. "The spring in the North Ridge would need to be piped down to the house site if you wanted reliable water," he said. "That's not complicated, just labor." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Are you offering to help me build it?" "I'm telling you that the labor is manageable," he said carefully. She turned to look at him, and there was that quality in her eyes again, the soft, unguarded one that only appeared when she lowered the practical surface, and also something questioning. "Jeremiah," she said, "what are you telling me exactly?" He looked at the road ahead for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I'm telling you," he said, "that I am not going to leave Calico Bend if you'll have that." She held his gaze steadily. "Have that," she said. "Meaning you." "Meaning me," he said. "If you want that. If the thought of that is agreeable to you. I realize I'm not proposing anything improper. I mean to say," he stopped, because he was making a complete mess of this, and self-sufficiency did not include eloquence on personal matters, apparently. Esther looked at him with enormous patience. "Jeremiah Dunlap," she said, "are you trying to tell me that you want to stay?" "Yes," he said, with considerable relief at being rescued from his own sentence. "And that you want to be here," she said. "Not just in Calico Bend, here meaning with me." "Yes," he said. She looked ahead at the trail for a moment. He could see the edge of her smile from the side. "Then stay," she said. They rode back into Calico Bend in the late afternoon of the following day, dusty and tired, and carrying something between them that had not been there when they left, something solid and defined that neither of them felt the need to make noise about. Clara Fitch took one look at them in the doorway and said, "Supper's at 6, with the expression of a woman whose read on a situation has been confirmed. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of Jeremiah's adult life, because they were ordinary in a way he had forgotten how to be. He helped Esther sort and organize additional documentation for Walt Hearn. He began looking seriously at the Langley property, walking the land with the eye of someone planning construction rather than just observing. He bought lumber from a supplier in the next town over, arranged for its transport, began the work of site preparation. He also continued her shooting lessons, though the dynamic between them had shifted entirely. They were not instructor and student anymore. They were two people who had acknowledged something and were still getting used to the dimensions of it. The shooting lessons became long afternoons that were more walk and conversation than drill, the revolver practice more comfortable than urgent now that the urgency behind it had been handed to Walt Hearn's capable office. One afternoon he watched her put 6 consecutive shots into a target at 30 yards, smooth and steady, with the practiced ease of someone who had genuinely learned. "You don't need me anymore," he said. "For this part anyway." She set the gun down and turned. "For shooting," she said. "For shooting," he agreed. "That is not the part I'm interested in keeping," she said. "I know," he said. She walked to him and put her hand flat on his chest, looking up at him, and he put his arm around her and held her there in the afternoon sun with the Nevada desert all around them and the dry, clean air, and the silence that was not emptiness but space. And for the first time in 4 years, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. The warrant from Walt Hearn's office came on a Thursday morning in the third week of October, delivered by a deputy who arrived on a sweating horse and went directly to the sheriff's small office on Front Street. By the Thursday afternoon, Gordon Price, who had continued to operate in the Calico Bend area under his own name, apparently confident in his invisibility, was taken into custody without incident, the arrest executed with the smooth efficiency of an office that had been preparing for it carefully. Jeremiah walked to the sheriff's office when he heard the commotion, and he found Esther already there, standing on the boardwalk outside with her arms crossed, watching through the window. Price was being restrained inside by the deputy and the Calico Bend sheriff. He was a man of perhaps 50, heavyset, and had indeed a smooth and pleasant manner that was currently absent, replaced by an ugly, cornered expression. Esther watched him through the window without moving. Jeremiah stood beside her. After a moment she said quietly, "I thought I would feel more." "What did you expect to feel?" he asked. "Triumph, perhaps," she said. "Justice." She was quiet. "Mostly I just feel tired." "You did a hard thing over a long time," he said. "That's how it feels at the end of it." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright again, that particular brightness that was not tears but something adjacent. "My mother would have been glad," she said. "I think she would have been more than glad," he said. "I think she would have been proud." She leaned against his arm briefly, just for a second, and then straightened and went inside to speak to the sheriff about the documentation, because Esther Langley was not done until the last form was filed. Walter Hearn's case against Gordon Price, whose real name, it turned out, was Gordon Price, with minor adjustments made to names as was common in territorial fraud, moved forward through the winter. The corroborating witness from Reno testified. Additional victims came forward once word moved through the territory, the way it always does when someone who has been afraid to speak sees someone else stand up first. It took 4 months and the involvement of the territory's federal circuit prosecutor, but in February of 1879, Gordon Price was convicted of multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 7 years in the Nevada State Prison. Esther received the news by telegraph. She was standing in the unfinished shell of the house on her father's land when the message was brought out to her by a boy from the telegraph office in town, because Jeremiah had collected it and wanted her to have it the moment it arrived. She read it once. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket and stood looking at the walls of the house that was becoming real around her, the stone foundation solid under her feet, the timber framing rising in the cold February air. "It's over," Jeremiah said from behind her. "It's over," she agreed. He came and stood beside her, looking at the half-built walls. They had been working on the house through November and December and January with the help of 2 local men he had hired, and the walls were mostly up now. The roof was framed but not yet covered. You could stand inside and look up through the framing at the winter sky. "This will be done by May," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Esther, Jeremiah, will you marry me?" She turned to look at him with that expression she had, the completely direct, evaluating one, and he waited. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." "Obviously," he said. "I've been waiting for you to get around to asking," she said. "I began to wonder if you needed prompting." "I was waiting for the right moment," he said. "You chose the moment standing in an unfinished house in February," she said. "I chose the moment when you just got the best news of the last 3 years," he said. "I thought that was timing." She looked at him for a second. "That is actually very good timing," she said. "I have my moments," he said. She kissed him then, with the cold February air around them, and the ghost of her father's original intention being built into something real and solid at last. And Jeremiah Dunlap held on to her and felt, in the simplest and most uncomplicated terms, that he was home. They were married in April 1879, in the small church on Front Street in Calico Bend, whose new minister had arrived in January, and was a sensible young man who did not ask too many questions about the brevity of the engagement. Clara Fitch cried with great dignity. Walter Hearn rode over from Elko and gave a toast at the supper that followed that was both brief and sufficient. Two of the local men who had helped build the house attended and ate enormously. Esther wore a dress she had made over the winter from blue cotton that matched, if anyone had been paying attention, the color of the Nevada sky on a clear day in October. Jeremiah wore his best clothes, which were still not very impressive, but he stood straight and looked at her when she came down the aisle of the small church, with an expression on his face that Clara Fitch later described to anyone who would listen as the look of a man who has finally found the place he was heading. They moved into the house on the Langley property, which Esther insisted on keeping as Langley property, and which Jeremiah agreed with entirely, on the 1st of May. The roof was solid. The kitchen hearth worked. The spring had been piped down from the ridge and ran clean and cold into a stone basin outside the kitchen door. There was a kitchen garden laid out and planted, and the seeds were just coming up. The first night in the house they sat on the porch they had built facing west and watched the sun go down behind the Nevada ridges, and the sky turned orange and then red and then the deep violet of true desert dark. "My father came here for exactly this," Esther said. "Did he ever see it?" "No," she said. "He never made it this far." She looked at the darkening land. "But I did." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the warm night settled around the house on the Langley property, and the stars came out one by one over the Nevada desert. The first years were good years. Hard years, because frontier life in 1879 and 1880 was not soft on anyone. The winters came sharp, and the summers came brutal, and there was always more work than there were hands to do it, but good years. The kind that built things rather than wearing them away. Jeremiah worked the land alongside Esther with the same thoroughness he had applied to everything in his life, and the practicality that had initially drawn him to her became, in daily close quarters, a quality he admired beyond almost anything else he knew in a person. She did not complain about what was hard. She solved it or adapted to it or, occasionally, sat down and said directly and without dramatics that a particular thing was beyond her today, and she needed help with it, and then accepted the help without guilt. He learned things about her that deepened what he felt. He learned that she woke early and was at her best in the first 2 hours of the morning, before the day got complicated. He learned that she was a better reader than anyone he had ever known, and that she had strong opinions about the things she read and liked to argue about them in the evening. He learned that she was, beneath the iron composure, quietly funny, not in a performing way, but in the way of a person who has been paying close attention to the world and occasionally reports back on what she finds there. He also learned that she had been more frightened than she had ever shown during the Price business. Not of Price himself, she genuinely was not easily frightened by physical things, but of failing her mother's memory, of going through it all and coming out the other end with nothing to show for it. "It mattered very much to me," she told him one evening 2 years in when they were talking about those early weeks. "That someone believed me, that you didn't treat it as a problem I needed to be talked out of." "It wasn't something to be talked out of," he said. "A great many people thought it was," she said. "In Kansas, including the man I mentioned, the one who wanted someone manageable. Yes," she was quiet. "He thought I should let it go, that pursuing Price was unhealthy. That it was keeping me from moving on." She paused. "He may have been right that it was consuming, but he was wrong that it didn't matter." "It mattered," Jeremiah said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for knowing that." She looked at him in the lamplight with that expression that was not the composed, measuring one, not the bright, unguarded one, but a third thing, warm and settled and sure. And he thought that no matter how many times he saw it, he was never going to get used to it in any way that made it less remarkable. Their son was born in January of 1881, in the bedroom of the house on the Langley property, with the help of the doctor from Calico Bend and Clara Fitch, who had appointed herself godmother the moment she heard the news. Esther labored for 7 hours with the self-contained focus she brought to difficult tasks. Jeremiah, who had been told to wait in the front room, did not do this particularly well, and spent the 7 hours moving between the porch and the kitchen and the front room in a state of barely contained anxiety that Clara Fitch interrupted twice to tell him, with brisk authority, was entirely counterproductive. When the doctor came out and said, "A boy, healthy," Jeremiah sat down in the nearest chair and put his head in his hands for a moment, which was not exactly the composed response he would have chosen. They named him Thomas Daniel Dunlap, Daniel for Esther's father, whose unfinished foundation had been built upon, whose land had been reclaimed and made into a living place, whose ghost lingered in the house in a way that felt, to both of them, more like company than sorrow. Thomas was, from the beginning, entirely his own person. He had Esther's dark hair and her unsettling directness, and also, mysteriously, a strong preference for being outdoors at all times that manifested as soon as he could walk. By the time he was 2, he was following Jeremiah around the property with complete seriousness, watching everything that was done with the same attentive, evaluating look his mother had. "He watches the way you do," Jeremiah told Esther. "Poor man," she said. "I didn't mean it as a complaint," he said. She looked up from the book she was reading and smiled at him. The full, warm one that she still did not produce casually, but that hit him, every time, with an impact disproportionate to its quietness. "I know you didn't," she said. "In 1883 they had a second child, a daughter they named Alina Ellie from the first week, because Clara Fitch began calling her that and it stuck. Ellie came into the world with a set of opinions already firmly established, and expressed them without hesitation from the beginning. She was fearless in a way that gave Jeremiah gray hairs and delighted Esther, who saw herself in it with the rueful recognition of a person who understands exactly what they have created. Thomas was 3 when Ellie arrived, and accepted her with the serious, inclusive manner of a child who had determined there was room. He assigned himself her protector immediately, which Ellie tolerated for approximately 6 months before she began firmly protecting herself. "Thank you," at which point Thomas reorganized his approach and became her co-conspirator instead, which was more sustainable for all parties. In the fall of 1883, Walter Hearn rode out to the Langley property on a Sunday afternoon with a bottle of decent whiskey and the news that Gordon Price had died in the Nevada State Prison in August, completing none of his 7-year sentence but expiring of a heart complaint instead. Esther received this news in her kitchen, flour on her hands from baking. She was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said. "That's that. How do you feel about it?" Walt asked. "The same way I felt when he was convicted," she said, "tired and glad it's finished." She looked at her hands, brushed the flour off them. "I spent a long time being angry at him. I don't have much of that left." "What do you have instead?" Walt asked. She looked through the kitchen window at the yard, where Jeremiah was teaching Thomas, who was 2.5 and barely reached his father's knee, to identify the different fence posts in a long-running game of his own invention. "This," she said simply. Walt looked at the same scene and nodded, with the look of a man confirming something he already knew. The years built on each other the way good years do, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary grief that any life accumulates, but with a foundation underneath them that held. They had dry years and wet years, and a late frost in 1884 that took most of the kitchen garden and required replanting, and a summer of careful accounting. They had good cattle years and a bad year when 3 animals died in a harsh February and had to be replaced. They had the general store in Calico Bend change hands twice, and a short-lived silver rush in the district in 1882 that brought a rush of strangers through and then departed, leaving the town mostly as it had been. Through all of it, the house on the Langley property remained what it was: solid stone walls, the spring running cold and clean from the ridge, the kitchen garden producing in good years, the porch facing west where the sunsets were still, 4 years and 6 years and 8 years on, as extraordinary as they had been the first evening. Esther continued to shoot. She kept the Colt her Colt, the one she had been issued with for her shooting lessons, and which Jeremiah had given her formally as a wedding gift, engraved with her initials on the grip, cleaned and in good order. She did not use it for anything dramatic, which she had never particularly intended. She used it the way a practical person in frontier country used a firearm, occasionally, and with the calm competence she had been taught. Thomas asked to be taught when he was 8. Jeremiah looked at Esther, and Esther said, "Ask your mother," and then looked at him, and he began the boys' lessons the following Saturday morning behind the house, and Esther stood on the porch and watched and felt something move through her that she could not have named precisely, but that had to do with how things pass forward, how something that was given to you becomes something you give in turn. When Thomas hit his first target clean at 10 yards, she watched him turn to his father with exactly the same bright, unguarded expression she had worn herself on a September afternoon in 1878, when a tin can spun off a post in the Nevada dust. Jeremiah saw it too. He turned and looked at her on the porch, and she looked back at him, and what passed between them in that look was the whole story, all of it, from the very beginning, the trunk that weighed too much and the breakfast table at Clara Fitch's, and the first time he had corrected her grip, and the long afternoon conversations, and the 60 miles to Elko, and the unfinished house in February, and 4 years and 6 years and 8 years of this ordinary, extraordinary life they had built together on the land her father had always meant to come back to. "Well," she said from the porch, to no one in particular. Jeremiah smiled. He had the look still, the one that Clara Fitch had described at their wedding, the look of a man who has finally found the place he was heading. He wore it more naturally now, without the careful distance behind his eyes that had been there when she first met him, the habit of a man who had decided things were safer from a remove. She thought sometimes of that man, the one who had been leaning against the post outside the land office on the afternoon she arrived, and how she had looked at him for 3 seconds and filed him away as possibly useful, probably complicated. She thought of the years-long joke between them, that he had been ruined by the shooting lesson, which was his version of the story and which she allowed him because it was essentially true, and because the word ruined was doing a great deal of interesting work in his telling of it. She had her own version. Her version was that she had arrived in Calico Bend with a hidden motive and a dark past folded up inside a leather satchel, and that she had asked a stranger to teach her something she needed, and that the stranger had said yes, and that in saying yes he had dismantled every plan she had to do this alone, because once she had his help and his honesty and his steady, unafraid presence, she could not go back to the alone version. The alone version had been necessary. The alone version had gotten her this far. But it was not this, this was this. The evening of the day Thomas had his first clean shot at a target, they sat on the porch again, the 4 of them this time, Thomas still flushed with the achievement of the afternoon, Ellie asleep with her head on Esther's lap, the Nevada sky performing its nightly extravagance, and Jeremiah said, with the casual ease of a man who has stopped being afraid of what he wants to say, "I reckon this is the best I've ever felt about anything." Thomas looked at him seriously. "Even the cattle drives." "Even the cattle drives," Jeremiah said. "Mrs. Fitch says you looked like a different person before you married Mama," Thomas said, with the frank reportage of children everywhere. "What kind of person did she say I looked like?" Jeremiah asked. Thomas considered this with his mother's evaluating expression. "She said you looked like someone who had forgotten where he was going," he said. Jeremiah looked at Esther. Esther looked back at him with the warm, settled, certain expression, the third one, the one he had been looking for in his memory since the day it first appeared. "Clara Fitch," she said, "is never wrong about anything." "No," he agreed. "She is not." Ellie stirred and resettled without waking, her small hand curled on Esther's knee. Thomas leaned against the porch rail and looked out at the darkening land with the serious, contented air of a boy who has been taught to look at things properly. The spring ran from the ridge in the near distance. The first stars came out over the Nevada desert. Jeremiah stretched his legs and looked at the sky and thought, as he sometimes did in these moments, about the afternoon that had changed everything. The tin can spinning off the post, the warm gun in Esther's hands, her turning to look at him with that unguarded brightness. The moment he had known he was ruined. He had been right about that. He was thoroughly, permanently, completely ruined in all the ways that mattered. He reached across and took Esther's hand in the evening dark, and she laced her fingers through his without looking up from the sky. And the night settled in warm and wide and quiet around the house that Daniel Langley had dreamed, and his daughter had built on the land he had left her, in the great open country of the Nevada Territory, in the year when the century was still young and the West was still wide, and two very particular people had found. Against the odds and by the grace of asking the right question at the right moment, exactly where they were supposed to be. And that was all. And that was enough. In 1886, they had a third child. A boy again, which Ellie received with the expression of someone who had expected better from the universe but was prepared to adapt. They named him William after nobody in particular, just because it suited him from the first morning. He had Jeremiah's gray eyes and his mother's mouth and Thomas's habit of going completely still when something interested him, and he slept through his first night in a way that suggested, Clara Fitch said, excellent character. The family filled the house on the Langley property, the way water fills a vessel completely, naturally, without leaving room to wonder about the shape of things before. Jeremiah built on a room in the spring of 1887, because 3 children and 2 adults in the original footprint was beginning to strain goodwill, and the addition came out well, with a new window that faced the eastern ridge and caught the morning light. The shooting range behind the house became, in time, a feature as ordinary as the kitchen garden, a place where instruction was given and received across generations, where Thomas brought his own patience and his father's careful eye to teaching Ellie, who turned out to be, Esther noted with private satisfaction, a better shot at 12 than either of them had been at that age, because she had started earlier and had better teachers. William would want his lessons in time, and he would get them, everything in its time, on the land that had been waiting since 1867 for someone to come and make use of it. The unfinished foundation finished at last, the seasonal creek running every March and April just as Jeremiah had said it would, the kitchen garden producing, the spring running clean from the ridge. And on the porch in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were settling, and the Nevada sky was doing what Nevada skies do, going wide and impossible with color, a performance too grand for the scale of the country watching it, Esther and Jeremiah sat together with the ease of people who have learned every room of each other and found nothing they cannot live with, and quite a great deal they cannot live without. He had been a man who kept moving. She had been a woman who came to a place with a secret and a plan and a leather satchel full of 3 years of careful work, looking for justice and expecting to leave. She had asked him to teach her to shoot. He had said yes. And he had never, not for a single day of all the days that followed, recovered from the lesson. He had no interest in recovering.